afternoon, and a very warm welcome from us all here at the Digital Futures of Work Research Centre. In a moment, we'll be starting today's event with Dr. Francesca Sabande. Today's event is also part of the Economic Social Research Council's Festival of Social Science and in association with the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics Women and Gender Forum. In a moment, I'll hand over to our chair for today's event, Digit's co-director, Professor Jacqueline O'Reilly, to introduce Francesca to you all.
Thank you very much for attending. Can I just give a shout out as well to the great SARSE team and to Martha, who I can see is on this call as well, because apart from hosting this event through the Digit Research Centre, we also wanted to do it in collaboration with SARSE and the Women and Gender Forum. And Martha's been quite instrumental in helping support us do that. And there are a lot of links on that site to issues around COVID and Black and gender issues arising from the pandemic. And also thanks to the ESRC for funding the centre to enable us to do this. Okay, I briefly want to introduce Francesca. I wanted to basically say why we'd invited Francesca. We met up in about March 2018 and was very impressed with Francesca's work using autoethnography to capture the Black women's digital lives. And as a quantitative researcher, having done some quantitative analysis using sensor data on ethnic groups in the UK labour market, Francesca came from looking at this topic in a very, very different methodological approach. And although ethnography is a very well-established methodology, I was really impressed by the kind of innovative new perspectives you could get from this. So much so that I was actually inspired to try and practice doing some of this type of methodology with some of my colleagues who are also mainly quantitative researchers. And what I wanted to say was essentially what I thought was interesting about bringing Francesca to talk about her work, apart from the topic, which is so important at the moment, was also for enable us as researchers to think about different ways that we can use new digital technologies to capture and innovate around creative ways of trying to understand these different types of experiences. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Francesca shortly now. Francesca is a lecturer in School of Journalism at Cardiff University, and we're really pleased to support her in her book launch today on the digital lives of Black women in Britain. So over to you, Francesca, who will talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A after that. Thank you, Francesca, for coming. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me speak today. I've been really looking forward to this event, and I'm going to be sharing some slides that will hopefully illustrate some of the key points that I'm talking through, including as part of our reflection on autoethnographic methodologies and different creative ways that as researchers, we can consider how our own lives and our own social positionalities are implicated in the work that we do. Yes, so I will be focusing on the digital lives of Black women in Britain. And a lot of the work that I'm currently still doing in this area stems from my PhD project, which started in 2015. And I'm aware that there'll be different people here today. Some of you might be researchers yourself. You may also be at very different stages of your career. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to include a few moments to reflect on the experience of moving from doing this PhD to writing a book about this topic and continuing to do work that focuses on the lives of Black women in Britain and elsewhere in the world. So as has been mentioned, I'm a lecturer in digital media studies at the School of Journalism, Media and Culture at Cardiff University, where I'm also director of the BA programme in Media Journalism and Culture. I'm also the co-communications chair of the International Race in the Marketplace network, which involves various scholars, practitioners, activists and individuals coming together across different countries and continents to do work that addresses issues to do with race and racism in various marketplace contexts, broadly defined. So I always like to highlight the work that's coming out of that space because, especially in 2020, there have been lots of conversations to do with racism, to do with anti-Blackness, to do with the marketplace. And there are many people who have been doing work that focuses on all of this for quite some time now. So my recent book, The Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain, it is a book that, although the focus is on digital experiences, and in particular, an exploration of how work and labour experiences are part of the different ways that Black women in Britain are using digital tools on a daily basis as part of social interactions, a leisure pastime. There are moments of joy and kinship that can be involved, and also a lot of moments of hardship too. So harassment and online abuse that is navigated. And the book that I wrote based on this work, I hope, is a book that not only draws on academic research, but also includes various autoethnographic reflections, which I'll speak a little bit more about shortly. And as I was still writing up the final stages of this book earlier this year, around about springtime, there are a few comments that consider what it means to be a Black woman in Britain today in 2020, how the focus on digital media and digital technology that we've seen as part of responses to COVID-19 and social distancing has also placed an additional burden upon Black women who have been already dealing with different difficulties in digital spaces for a long time before 2020, but who now might find that they are being encouraged or coerced or forced to be especially visible online in ways that can really compromise their health, well-being, and their safety too. So how did all of this start? As I mentioned, in 2015, I began a PhD in marketing with a focus on critical approaches to consumer culture at the University of Dundee. Before this, I'd been an undergraduate in sociology and politics at the University of Edinburgh. So I feel that a critical sociological and political approach has really underpinned my work for a long time. And initially, this project was going to be really dealing with the different ways that Black women in Britain are depicted on television, and also how Black women in Britain were engaging with media representations at that time. So when I started the project, although I was thinking a little bit about social media and digital media, the emphasis really was on TV and mainstream media in different domains. But as soon as I began to do interviews, which have really formed the core of this research, it became very clear that many other Black women were turning away from mainstream media, were actively seeking out different digital spaces, digital communities, digital tools as a way to create, curate, and share different depictions and different pieces of content that were often glaringly absent in mainstream television and different mainstream media spaces. So something that I often say to people who are perhaps considering a PhD or at the early stages of the project is there's this real sort of balancing act between pursuing the work that you want to do and also being open to finding out the reality of the experiences that you're exploring. What is it that is pertinent at that moment in time? And sometimes it might be slightly different to what you originally thought would be the case. So for me, this sort of move away from thinking about TV and this move towards digital formed a central part of the work that I continue to do today. And as well as conducting interviews with other Black women in Britain about their media experiences and lives more generally, I made use of autoethnographic reflections in the form of creative writing, journaling, drawing, painting. So hopefully there are some images on the slide that you may be able to see, which include drawings and paintings and notes that I made as a way to not only think about my research and what it was that I was looking at, but also my experience of the research process. So it was very clear to me from early on in this research journey that people would have questions around why I was doing this work, who I was connected to this work and the way I approached it, and also questions around, unfortunately, whether or not it was of value to do work that focuses specifically on Black women. And for me, autoethnographic methodological approaches not only provide a really rigorous way to deal with research and to look at different issues and different experiences in society, but they were often a really central part of how I tried to iteratively reflect on ethical considerations when doing this work, and also remain grounded and remind myself of who I am within this work and also who I am beyond it too. So as part of this project, I was thinking about entangled processes of what might be referred to as Black cultural transmission and consciousness raising. So in other words, I was looking at the different ways that Black women were sharing knowledge, were connecting across countries, and were connecting in ways that might involve reflecting on their different cultural experiences, the specifics of who they are. And the consciousness raising element might involve connecting in ways that is sort of located within a shared politics. So that might be at times connecting with other Black women who were doing consciousness raising work around Black feminism or anti-capitalism. And amidst all of this, as I mentioned earlier on, there were many moments that indicated the different ways that work and labour is very much a part of how some Black women in Britain experience digital spaces, social media, and what they do online. So knowledge production is also always at play with all of this. And something that I challenge as part of my work, or attempt to challenge, is the idea that knowledge production only occurs within academic institutions. And actually something that came out of this research was, many examples of the different types of what we might view pedagogical work or knowledge creation and the redistribution of knowledge as well that is happening online as a result of what Black women are doing, often as part of unpaid work, unrecognized work, and work that is commonly erased even within academic institutions. And as part of this, I was also thinking about the notion of Black digital diaspora. And this involved really thinking about the different ways that the digital experiences of Black women in Britain are shaped by tensions between digital cultures, potentially sort of communal, countercultural, and commercial qualities. So thinking about what it might mean to feel as though you're a part of this wider Black diasporic experience and part of this wider collectiveness, but also exploring that in digital spaces that are very much tethered to commercial entities and capitalist structures that are entangled with forms of anti-Blackness and the oppression of Black people. So my theoretical framework and praxis, it can be hard to try and cover this in a few minutes, but I'm going to do my best to highlight some of the key work that has really informed the way that I do research and understand the world, or attempt to understand it as part of the work that I do. And for me, Black feminism and Black cyberfeminism has been foundational to this. So this includes the work of scholars such as Kishana Gray, who has done incredible Black cyberfeminist work that is just really brilliant in terms of providing an understanding of the nuanced ways that Black women might experience certain digital technologies, and how there can be moments where liberationist goals can be pursued partly as part of the way people use technology, or moments of play and moments of joy, but also this Black cyberfeminist approach really accounts for the interconnected nature of anti-Blackness, sexism, misogyny, ableism, and different forms of oppression that are sometimes treated as separate entities as part of unhelpful frameworks that really diminish the lives of Black women. So critical race and digital studies has also been really important in terms of me grappling with the various ways that Black women in Britain make use of digital media. And this includes work such as Safina Noble's brilliant book, Algorithms of Oppression, How Search Engines Reinforce Racism, Andrew Brock's work on distributed Blackness, and Anna Everett's work on digital diaspora as well. So the work of many Black scholars who've been doing fantastic research that focuses on digital spaces and the lives of Black people has been so vital for me with regards to the work that I do. And thinking through digital Blackness also involves thinking about racial capitalism and making connections to Black Marxist thought as well. So for me, when we're talking about capitalism, when we're talking about class structures, we're always talking about issues to do with race as well. We're always talking about the legacy of colonialism, the enslavement of Black people, and how capitalist structures exist in ways that are fundamentally based upon racist foundations. And the work of Ruha Benjamin on race after technology has offered a really incredible account of lots of related issues, including how inequalities are encoded into technological processes, and the different ways that contemporary economic activity is reflective of the pervasiveness of anti-Blackness. And commodification processes, of course, are a part of all of what I'm exploring when I'm dealing with this topic. So from the thesis to the book, moving away from the end of my PhD project in 2018 and thinking about what didn't I have a chance to look at in detail that I now have more space, more scope to explore, I found that there was, for me, less of a focus on the content of representations in media. And when it came to approaching my book, I wanted there to be much more of a focus on the politics and power dynamics that were impacting Black women's experiences of work, labour, and different technologies and spaces. So what this meant for me was that at this stage, I was really trying to interrogate the different structures that limit the potential for Black women to seek out meaningful and paid work in digital environments in the same way that we often see non-Black people being able to do. And I was also trying to account for more of the history of Black women's experiences of media and activism in Britain. So when I was working my thesis, I was really focusing on the contemporary moment, whilst also drawing on the past as well. But by the time I arrived at working on my book, I realized I wanted to spend a lot more time looking at archived material and analyzing the different ways that Black women have been doing a lot of work to address their misrepresentation in the media and their exclusion from media spheres for decades. So this involved sometimes working with spare rib digital archive material, as well as resources accessed at the Black Cultural Archives, BCA in Brixton, London. So why the digital lives of Black women in Britain? For me, this is a question that shouldn't demand an answer. I'm definitely at this point in my life not going to spend a lot of time justifying why this work is of value and why it is important. But this opening chapter of my book, The Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain, includes me thinking a bit about the significance of what is happening right now in terms of what Black women are doing and experiencing online. And I'm always thinking about how what might be viewed as local, national, regional, and transnational relations are a part of all of this. So in this opening chapter, I also reflect on where I write from. So again, this is bringing in some of the self-reflexive comments about who I am, what it means and that I was born in Scotland, have lived there for most of my life, then lived in England for a short amount of time, and I'm now based in Wales, how that contributes to the particular way that I view some of these issues and my understanding of the dynamics between nations within Britain, and how that has a knock-on impact on work and labour experiences, especially when we're dealing with the creative and cultural industries and certain hubs in the UK where there may be more opportunities in comparison to others. So this is just a brief excerpt from chapter 1, which gives you a sense of how I was thinking about different issues to do with identity, to do with nationality, and to do with the specifics of Britain as part of this. So for me, given that the concept of Britishness is often equated with experiences in England, with little to no connection to those in Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, I chose to try and observe differences between the notion of being British and being in Britain. So I really wanted to avoid undermining the different national and regional specific ways that Black women in Britain might identify or be identified as, including English, Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish. I also wanted to avoid negating the experiences of Black women who may primarily identify with a sense of nationhood located outside of Britain, as well as the experiences of those who don't identify with a sense of nationhood or citizenship at all, especially to draw on the words of Ruha Benjamin, any notion of citizenship that might be based on a transactional model, which presumes that people's primary value hinges on the ability to spend money, and in the digital age, expend attention, browsing, clicking, buying. And I'm especially interested in how ideas to do with citizenship and national identity right now are being conceptualized or promoted as part of conversations to do with the emphasis on consumption and this emphasis on buying or going out to eat to save the economy, as it's sometimes framed. How these different ideas to do with consumerism are often very much pushed as part of discourse that connects to citizenship and nationality. So just to reiterate this point, the title of my book, I really wanted it to be The Digital Lives of Black Women in Britain, to just account for the different experiences and backgrounds of the women that I would be speaking to, and I had already spoken to. So as I've already indicated, I am always wanting to try and acknowledge how regionality and rurality can be part of this. And sometimes when we hear people speaking about the lives of Black people in Britain, they really homogenize the different lives that people are experiencing right now. So some of the conversations I had with Black women who lived in rural parts of Britain involved them talking about difficulties in terms of accessing consistent and strong internet connections. And there was one person who I spoke to who said that they have mainly lived somewhere with generated electricity, which means that the electricity goes off. So they said there have been no neighbours, so it's fairly remote, and their mother's mother would make video recordings from films that were on TV. And I've included these comments because I think it's an important reminder to avoid speaking about the digital experiences and lives of Black women in Britain in ways that are based on the assumption that Black women all have the same degree of access to digital technology and digital spaces as one another, when that's just not the truth. So chapter 2 of my book then starts to focus more so on Black women's media history in Britain. So this is looking at examples of self-representing and organising around Black women in the media, and dealing with this politics of representation. So really challenging this idea that superficial forms of representation or a rise in the number of Black women featuring in the media or in certain spaces seems to involve any meaningful change in terms of structural oppression and any meaningful change that actually impacts their material conditions. So as part of this chapter, I really try and critically engage with the statement representation matters and push against that and spend some more time drawing on the work of brilliant scholars and activists such as Stuart Hall to think about the politics of representation right now and the different ways that commercial organizations sometimes weaponize that as a way to claim that they're doing something substantial to tackle racism and anti-Blackness, but which ultimately only involves them making some symbolic gestures in the form of changing representations that don't speak to any significant changes in terms of tackling inequality. And I've included another excerpt from the book here, and this is just based on some of the material that I accessed at the Black Cultural Archives. And there are many bulletins, there are many documents that really indicated the different ways that Black women for a long time have been critical of how digital technology is used or used against them, and also critical of the power relations that might be embedded in information communication technology, as it was especially referred to in the 80s with regards to this example. And a challenge that I have had to deal with when doing this work, and a challenge I still deal with now, is that quite often we will see terms such as Black, Asian, and minority ethnic and the equivalent acronyms used as part of projects that don't involve disaggregating data. And then it can be difficult to actually determine within projects that claim to be about a large group of people, where are Black women's experiences showing up, or can we actually understand the specifics of Black women's experiences within that work? So I'm always looking at archival material with a critical awareness of how different terms to do with race and racialized identities have been used in Britain, and sometimes or arguably often in ways that actually obscure the realities that Black women face. And Black women's media industry experiences, now bringing it back to sort of the 21st century, some of the different conversations I had with people included conversations that made it clear there were moments when there was an opportunity to become more involved in the media industry and pursue potentially fruitful work, but that an awareness of the types of discrimination and abuse and potential violence that Black women would face as a result of doing that work meant that they may turn down opportunities. And in this case, I was speaking to a woman who's based in Scotland, and she's a Black African Muslim woman. And she was saying that she really wanted to pursue a career in this area, but that she was very concerned about what it would mean to be hyper visible in that context, and whether or not institutions that she might be working for would support her when it came to dealing with harassment. So for me, I was reflecting on the futility of media industry diversity initiatives, which are marketed as enabling Black people's entry into careers in the industry, but which can ultimately fail to identify institutional measures to actually support such individuals in the likely event that their hypervisibility in the media leads to abuse from the public, including in this case, anti-Black, xenophobic, sexist, misogynistic, and Islamophobic abuse, which is also impacted by colorism and the way that society treats light-skinned Black people in a very preferential way. And typically when media organizations are wanting to reach out to a Black person or are attempting to amplify Black voices, as they'll say, they'll typically approach a light-skinned Black person because of their proximity to whiteness and lightness in terms of their embodiment. So it was really a case of reckoning with what it means to see there are so many Black women who want to pursue work in the creative and culture industries and who are more than qualified for many roles, but who are worried about the abuse they will face, not only from the public, but also from some of the institutions they may want to work for. And what does that then mean for people who claim to be committed to creating different measures or initiatives or policies to address this, and which go beyond simply trying to encourage Black people to enter these environments? How are they going to change the environment so that Black people can thrive in them and they're not faced with hostility when they arrive there? So a legacy of self-organizing This is from some of the spare rib material that I accessed, and this was a discussion to do with different media conferences and events that Black women were putting together at that time in the 80s to really address the type of inequality they were facing and to address the different ways that the media was a part of this. So this comment was saying this event, it addressed Black women's access to the media's role in perpetuating racism and sexism, a Black women's media network, access to the media and sharing skills training courses, and control of images presented of Black women in the media. And they were also critiquing how the so-called feminist media and Black media at that time could be much more accountable to Black women's needs and issues. And it really, when it came to writing this book, I really wanted to make sure that there was a good amount of recognition of this work that has existed for decades, because I think sometimes sort of more dominant conversations in mainstream media and political spheres in Britain will imply that a lot of what Black women are doing right now is just emergent or it's just new, when there's a history of Black women doing the sort of work to address the types of issues that I'm exploring in my research, and that history is often actively dismissed and denied. So between community, creativity, and commodification, at this point, you're probably aware that I've been really trying to wrestle with the different ways that Black women might make use of digital media and digital tools as part of enriching and community-oriented work and creative work, and also just as part of the fun that they have in their lives. But there are also these commodification processes that can very much be harmful, and which can also involve Black women's work and labour being exploited and extracted. So I was looking at the different ways that Black women in Britain have been and continue to carve out their own narratives, their own spaces, and often, rather than focusing on the language of inclusion and attempting to enter spaces that they know are going to be harmful to them, Black women are looking for ways to create new platforms, to find a way where there is no way. And this also involves, though, really having to face the reality of corporate co-optation at times, the spectacularization of Black people and their lives, and superficiality. And I'd say we've seen a lot of this year in terms of, all of this, but the superficial brand and commercial responses to conversations to do with anti-Blackness and to do with the galvanizing visibility of Black Lives Matter organizing and Black activist and grassroots work. So alongside this project for several years, I've been doing work that focuses on the notion of woke washing. So that's the different ways that commercial organizations have been attempting to contribute to conversations to do with social justice issues and activism, especially with a focus on Black activism and feminism, but in ways that ultimately involves them pursuing profit and prioritizing profit over people and looking for promotional opportunities and managing their reputational risk, as opposed to substantially supporting grassroots organizing in a sustained way. And this excerpt here was based on a time, sort of several years ago now, really. But I think this year we have seen just the expansion of so many moments when corporations are attempting to co-opt what Black people are doing. They're attempting to spectacularize them, not only the harm that they experience, but to spectacularize their moments of joy as well. And they're sometimes presenting the content that they are creating as organizations, which is very much at the surface level in terms of representation, but they're trying to present that as being some sort of revolutionary anti-racist act. So here I'm reflecting on the different conversations I've had with people who have said that public discussions they have on social media might be used and mined by non-Black individuals and institutions in search of material for article pitches and content that those organizations or people feel connect to Black cultural references, but without having to involve or credit Black people, especially Black women. So there are moments where we're seeing uses of perceived signifiers or misuses of perceived signifiers of Blackness. And this maybe connects back nicely to the work of Hall again, when thinking about Black people and Black popular culture and how that's digitally mediated right now. And examples of the digital, not only commentaries, but theorizing and knowledge production and pedagogical work of Black people being passed off by non-Black individuals and organizations as part of careerist work. So it's not all doom and gloom. As I said, there is this real messiness to all of this. I think the last thing that is helpful is to try and compartmentalize what's going on in a neat way, which sometimes as part of the PhD process you feel compelled to do as part of the creation of a thesis and trying to construct a narrative that's often meant to appear linear in nature and very conclusive and definitive. But all of this is ongoing. And although there are a lot of dangers and risks involved in the digital experiences of Black women in Britain, there are also moments where people are making their own spaces. It's very DIY, making their own iconography, and as this person said, making their own content. It's really important that we carve out our own narratives and that we don't shy away from creating spaces for ourselves. And right now, there are so many different examples of the work that Black women have been doing to make this happen. But there are also always examples of how those DIY elements, the agency of Black women and the politics that's at the root of that work is sometimes potentially being compromised or is being overseen by predominantly white commercial organizations looking for something to market and something to give them with an edge. So digital censorship and abuse is something else that Black women very much have to deal with. And this is where it's really important to think of the fantastic work of Moya Bailey and Trudy with regards to misogynoir and providing this language and an understanding of the interconnected nature of anti-Blackness, misogyny, sexism, heteronormativity, and the different ways that Black women experience oppression as a result of all of that. So someone I spoke to said there's this spectacularization. And this was when thinking about social media and why they very much moved away from it and never really wanted to be a part of it in the first place, but felt the pressure to. There's a spectacularization and superficiality and bullying. This social media is not a decolonized space. It's not a safe space. I think the thing that comes into my head is that I'm no longer on Facebook, but from what I understand, these platforms can censor people speaking their truths about racism. That often if you talk about whiteness, there seems to be algorithms that seem to shut the conversation down. I find that talking about decolonial processes, talking about racism in a language that they do not deem as acceptable, means that you're shut down from having the conversation. And they went on to say that the contrast to this is they saw many examples of racists, of white supremacists, of people, talking, providing hate speech, harassing people online in ways that seemed to be far from censored or managed or dealt with in the same sort of way that they felt Black women and racialized people speaking out about racism face when they're just speaking their truth and they're trying to challenge these types of oppression. So there was this real disconnect between the censorship that this person feels Black women are experiencing and which we see Black women experience, and the censorship or lack of censorship and lack of moderation and management of the hate speech and anti-Blackness that is very much present online. So there were lots of discussions I had with people about institutional anti-Black racism and the creative and culture industries. In this case, someone was reflecting on a very well-known creative and culture industry organization who was refusing to acknowledge the anti-Blackness that is a part of their structure and how they operate. And they said, when I spoke to them about how the organization is not representing me and my brothers and sisters, Black and brown in the UK, they simply said, we've got, and they named one Black woman employee, as though that was an indication of the fact that they cannot possibly be anti-Black or sexist or oppressive. And this person I interviewed said, I say all this in relation to how they use media, as I noticed on their Instagram, they'll often have an image of a Black person sat outside looking like they were minding their own business. They've instrumentalized this young Black person. I think there needs to be a whole rewriting of it. That's sort of social media and the way a lot of these organizations run. Black women need to be making these programs and these platforms. And to start to wrap things up, towards the end of the book, I'm dealing a lot more with different Black digital diasporic experiences. So thinking about the work of Anna Everett on digital diaspora and Black people's online activities. And I was also thinking about the notions of borders. So borders in relation to geographical contexts, and borders also in relation to the borders of digital environments, and even the borders of perceived identity. So the different ways that identity is understood in different parts of the world, different perceptions of Blackness, and different examples of dialogue between Black people in Britain and the US, thinking about the relationship between Black American popular culture and pop culture here. So I was trying to conceptualize the borders of experiences of Black identity and also the borders of digital space. And this led to me questioning what constitutes a border and how borders and perceptions of them impact issues to do with Black lives in cyberspace and the surrounding political landscape. So while it's far from being uncontained and borderless, media can be a means for messages and people to appear to overcome borders or transcend them, even if ephemerally, such as by communicating with others in different geocultural locations and time zones. Still, the digital experiences of Black people are far from being borderless. They are shaped by physical and virtual geographies and many layers of power and politics. And here, for me, this is where the fantastic work of scholars such as Aziza Johnson is so important with regards to thinking about Black geographies, Black space, and thinking about ideas to do with borders as well. And when we speak about the experiences of Black people, whose lives tend to be foregrounded and whose lives tend to very much be overlooked. And finally, towards the end of my book, I spent a lot more space really dedicated to thinking through knowledge production and knowledge sharing and how social media and platforms such as YouTube relate to this. And early on in the PhD process, I was really looking at some of the potentially resistant credentials of the digital experiences of Black women in Britain, while reckoning with potentially conflicting aspects of what might be viewed as countercultural practices in a predominantly white context, but which exist also in this wider digital consumerism environment. So this discussion, as I said, featured analysis of how Black American popular culture and digital culture contributes to some of the digital encounters and lives of Black women in Britain. Overall, this chapter focuses on Black women's experiences of knowledge sharing online, including through natural hair video blogs, vlogs, and YouTube. But really since then, and as a result of ongoing brilliant work coming out of critical race and digital studies, it's really clear that we can't think about a space such as YouTube as being utopian in nature. So although there are moments where Black creativity can flourish, there are moments of joy and connection and community that might to some extent be mediated by different digital spaces and platforms. The reality is Black people's lives are not dependent on these platforms, and actually making use of these platforms and existing in these spaces often involves dealing with a lot of harm and a lot of potential abuse as well. Thank you very much for your time, and I have really enjoyed having the chance to share my work with you today. I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have, and thanks again.
Well, thank you very much, Francesca, for a fantastic talk all the time and very rich. There's 2 or 3 little things I just wanted to say. I suppose one of the ideas I was really interested in your book was about things where you talk about how there's a simultaneous erasure and visibility of Black voices through digital media. And that's a kind of an idea that I think I've become very interested in the past year or 2, about who becomes visible through the internet. And Black Lives Matter is clearly one example of that. #MeToo was another example. So you saw a way of the internet enabling voices that previously weren't heard. This channel enabled them to be heard. But I think what's interesting as well that you brought out is who gets erased or moderated or censored out of that. And I think that tension between the 2 concepts is really interesting, about where you get a kind of grassroots, bottom-up expression of communities, and what are the groups of power that can channel those or constrain them. I think that's a really interesting idea in the work you're doing. And maybe not an easy question to answer. You also talk about how, in a very interesting way, how different Black communities and Black women's communities are connected or disconnected. So a question you don't have to answer straight away is, the concept of connectedness is really central to the Digit Research Centre. So what do we mean by the connected worker or the connected economy? And I suppose, would you like to, you've listed some of the things here. If you were to give some tips to the great research team we have, of which you're now part of it because you've been funded through the Innovation Fund for a new project, I've put a link on the question and answers so you can see a project Francesca's leading on this year on creators of colour. So my question is, have you got any tips of where you would suggest research agendas should go in looking at these concepts of connectedness and disconnectedness?
I think for me, the concepts of connectedness and disconnectedness can, to use the word connected again, can be connected to questions to do with visibility. And I think sometimes the conversations that we see happening, the focus on expansion or visibility or connectedness and growth, sometimes doesn't involve a critical exploration of what does it mean to recognize those moments when being disconnected or disengaged from or being less visible or hard to recognize can actually be important in terms of people's survival strategies. So I think my question is always connected to who or connected to what, and is that sense of connectedness something that is mutual? And are there two people or two entities that feel that sense of connection, or is one person or one entity claiming to be connected to another when that's not the case? And I think when we're dealing with the sorts of spaces that we're speaking about right now, I feel as though I'm seeing lots of examples of commercial organizations claiming to be either connected or perhaps connected, sometimes too strong, but aligned or interested in or supporters of different communities, when we know that's often not the case. So I think I'd always encourage people and organizations to just critically reflect on how these terms are being used and who they're being used about, and if that feeling is shared, if it's a mutual feeling. And because if not, I think there's something else that's going on there, where something is being done to someone or something, as opposed to there is that mutual sense of connection.
I've got loads of other questions I'd love to ask you, and I also love the idea of this geographical diasporas and how these are linked up, because I think that is something that's really not very well recognised, how people's migration trajectories historically and through their lived families affect their existence as Black, British and or other migrant communities. But let's save that for another day. Right, Asha, do you briefly want to?
I will, Jackie, thank you. And Francesca, thank you very much for a really stimulating and interesting talk. I'm Asha Rosbiliosi. I'm a lecturer in a range of digital areas in Brighton Business School. So primarily working in the business domain, but very interested by the role of media as something that provides other channels. I had two questions and I don't want to be greedy, so I think I'll offer one for the moment. I'm interested in how, Francesca, what you see as the sort of sustained role of media being used by Black communities for purposes of networking, solidarity, resistance, which I feel in the UK has a long and interesting history. One could go back to, I don't know, Peter Fryer's book on staying power, showing substantive publication long before we had digital archives. I was fascinated by you choosing Spare Rib as a source, but thinking about more contemporary Black channels around grime and hip hop, or Black newspapers around Rastafari, for example, seems to me there has been a consistent strand of co-opting and use. I'll stop.
Yeah, I think there are definitely many different examples of the press and media work that Black people in Britain have been involved in for a very long time. So I know there's a book on Black press by I think Ioni Benjamin, and there are so many different examples in the Black Cultural Archives and even the Glasgow Women's Library, where whether it is leaflets or bulletins, print copy, the different ways that Black women and Black people in Britain have been using media as part of grassroots organising. And I think right now, to think about some more recent examples, because of the way that visibility is enabled by sort of digital media and social media, and the rise of, I guess, more dialogic communication channels as a result of social media and the move away from a more traditional one-to-many broadcast model, I think what's risky or what's maybe trickier to deal with now is just the level of surveillance that has been facilitated by different digital technologies, which makes it perhaps at times even easier for different organizations and more commercial entities to try and observe what Black people are doing, to try and claim it as their own, and to try and co-opt what's happening. So I would never write off digital media and digital spaces as not providing opportunities for Black people to do work on their own terms. And the brilliant work of Sarah J. Jackson and Moya Bailey and I think Brooke and Foucault-Wells on hashtag activism really gets at the importance of examples where people are mobilizing with the use of digital technology. But I think when we're thinking about this, in the context of Britain and the history of Black women making use of media, the more visible that Black people are online, the more we're seeing organizations engaging with them in ways that are ultimately at odds with the lives of Black people and their liberationist work.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that's really useful to be reminded of that, because the risk of sort of co-opting the pattern of appropriation is very strong, and the need for sort of almost like a coding that helps to keep invisible what is being made visible amongst those who want to share messages. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Asha. Chris, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Hello, Francesca. I'm particularly interested in any long-lasting solutions that you found in your research. So, given the fact that people have a visceral need to create, to earn a meaningful income, and to control or protect what they create, and possibly leave a legacy, did you come across any mechanisms through which this could be done? So, for example, cooperatives or any other kind of response, because you want to create something, you want to do something with it, but then there's always that risk that somebody comes along and just rips you off. So just any positives in terms of what people actually created beyond the initial creative thing that they did would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is where the role of collectives has been so crucial to a lot of examples of what Black people are doing in ways that effectively sort of manages these forms of potential co-option. And I think this balancing act between trying to make work visible when it feels as though it's in the interest of different communities, but also not pursuing sort of visibility as a means to an end. So I think I'd love to say I have some very clear solutions to address all of this, but I think rather than framing it that way, what I do feel has come out from my work is this real question around the focus on visibility and representation as it's often framed in mainstream media and political environments, and much more of an embracement of the benefits of more private work and the benefits of doing things under a collective name and as part of a grassroots community, as opposed to as a standalone individual. So I definitely think while some people spoke about being less inclined to share a lot of their work online in the way that they once previously did, they also recognized that that was an important way for them to still seek out work, but they were maybe sharing it in less spaces. And there were also clear moments when people were part of knowledge networks, which involved passing on tips about which digital environments or which organizations to avoid, and the other places where work could be shared as part of the pursuit of paid opportunities, but without sharing it in a way that might expose you to exploitation and abuse in the same way.
Great, thank you. Can I move on to Claire Hudson?
Hi, I'm Claire Hudson. I'm a radio producer, so I'm not an academic, and I work in Wales. I'm just really interested in the phrase you used, spectacularization, and wonder whether you could say more about that. And I'm wondering whether you're feeling that it may sometimes lead to the masking of what might otherwise be called, unfortunately, everyday racist incidents, and there becomes a higher and higher premium on extreme cases. So the realities that Black women may be living with every day are discussed less, and what kind of impact that might have on Black women and Black people generally seeing that material.
Yeah, so I think for this term spectacularization, part of why I find that the term to be useful is I feel it implies there's a process going on there, that there's something that's maybe done to someone. And I think when we think about the spectacle that can surround the ways that Black people are depicted in the media, whether that's as part of narratives that inherently portray them in incredibly derogatory ways, or as part of narratives that position organizations as saviors, I think what we see is Black people's lives are often treated as though they are a source of clickbait, a source of marketable, sometimes content to do with trauma, by organizations that will share material that they think is helping to raise awareness of issues, but can also really perpetuate the re-traumatization that Black people experience as part of their engagement with media. So this spectacularization, I feel, also connects to the market logics that we see going on, whereby organizations or particular types of media organizations that support particular types of political positions will know that something's going to result in a response, and they may know that they're producing content or sharing content that's ultimately harmful to Black people, but they know it can generate a spectacle, a sense of spectacle that can also help them to pursue profit. So for me, this spectacularization is ultimately associated with the negative ways that Black people are drawn into media narratives and are depicted as part of wider strategies to ultimately generate profit and stay relevant as media organizations looking for something to create interest.
I have two more questions, and I need to give a shout out to say thanks to the ESRC for funding this, thanks to SARSE for joining us in this great adventure. So anyway, let me hand over now, having said those last plugs, to Fatima in North Carolina.
Yeah, my name is Fatima Hadaji. I am I'm actually a graduate student at the North Carolina State University School of Social Work, pursuing my master's in social work. And I'm working with a faculty member here who is studying the mental health of Black and African American women, specifically around the time of COVID and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. My specific interest is how digital media impacts Black women's mental health. So I just wondered if you have any thoughts on health, specifically health information dissemination, how resources get to Black and African American women, or how Black and African American women are talking about their health in the digital world.
Thank you. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'd also say please feel free to get in touch with me over email as well. We can have a longer conversation. But I think that there are definitely scholars such as Rihanna Walcott in Britain who's done a lot of work around mental health and Black women's lives. And there are also, again, examples of how Black women are making use of social media and digital technology to raise awareness and share vital knowledge that is often absent from more institutional mental health and healthcare settings. So I think beyond that, I could speak for longer, but I know we've only got a few minutes. And I'd say I think another place that's doing brilliant work is the Free Black University, and they have a fantastic e-library with a whole range of resources that can be freely accessed, including my book. So yeah, I think there's a lot of really good information out there, but I'm happy to have a longer conversation another time.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Fatima. And a last question, Gabriella, would you like to ask your question about consciousness raising and legacies?
My name is Gabriela Loureiro, and I'm a PhD student based in London. And I also look at consciousness raising and digital activism in Brazil in my work. And I have seen used archival work as well. And there's a lot of archives of consciousness raising feminist activities in the 80s from white feminists in the US and the UK. Like the Brixton Black feminist groups in like other Black feminist groups, the archives show a lot of work with welfare, access to welfare, and other type of anti-racist struggles. And I've perceived a kind of whitewashing of consciousness raising in the archives that I had access to, at least. And I was wondering what is your take on this, on Black feminist consciousness raising from the 80s until today, and how if you agree that there's a certain whitewashing of that activity?
Yeah, I know we've only got 2 minutes, so hopefully this will be fairly short and sweet, but I agree that's something that happens. And I think this is where books such as focusing on the heart of the race and the lives of Black women in Britain is so important, and the different collectives and grassroots groups that Black women in Britain have been a part of. So I'd say those archives often exist, but in different ways, but those archives are rarely recognised or financially supported in the same ways we see other archives being enabled. So yeah, I agree.
I want to say thank you very much, Francesca, for a fascinating presentation. Congratulations on your new book. Thank you very much to all the people who participated for such a really vibrant discussion. As Francesca said, you can follow her up